All right, everyone, let's go ahead and continue with where we were on Chapter 3. The next thing that we're going to talk about is how to identify files and file types and directories in Linux, and we're going to talk about a couple other options that we have to do things. But one of the things that we're going to be doing for some of the rest of this chapter is messing around with text files, and it's easiest to do this if you kind of understand what the text file is. So I've put some stuff on Blackboard that should be able to help. The stuff that is in the little folder for today has a link to a page that is going to talk about file types in Linux in a little bit more detail than what I'm going to do right now. So this is the book wants to tell us what all the possible file types are that you could possibly see in Linux right now, and right now it hasn't told us exactly what all of those are. So some of the things that we're going to talk about may be a little bit, if we say, well, this is a linked file, well, we may not know what that means yet, and that's fine. But if all we're trying to do at this point is identify them, and we'll talk about what they are a little bit later. The other thing that we're gonna do is that if you come into Chapter 3 resources at the bottom, there's something that says the short text file and something that has a long text file. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and right click on each one of them and open them in a new tab. And then I'm going to go ahead, you can see that this one right here is a copy of the Gettysburg Address. I'm just going to say save this page as gettysburg.txt in gsmith downloads. That's fine. And then I'm going to go ahead, and this I believe is one of the Shakespearean plays. I've forgotten which one. I should probably know this. Let's see if we can go ahead and save this one too. And oh, it's the Tempest. So there we are. And we can actually, for what we're going to be doing, could actually use any text file that we wanted to, including some log files on the system. But it's been my experience that it's easier to show people what's going on if you have a text file that everybody knows kind of what it's supposed to look like. And we should at least have a passing familiarity with the Gettysburg Address. If you don't know what that is, then take it up with your history teacher. We're not going to go over it in here. But if I go into downloads, I should be able to do an ls, and I should see these things here. And hey, we have text files. We'll talk about what that means in just a bit. So in Linux, there are all sorts of files, and if you guys are familiar with Windows, and even just more than kind of a passing thing, you'll probably be aware of how this works. In Windows, if you have something that ends in, say, a doc or a docx file, that's going to be a Microsoft Office Word file, right? If it's a .ppp or ppp, it's going to be a PowerPoint file. If it's an XLS, it's going to be an Excel file. And if it's a PDF, then it's a PDF file. And all of these files have kind of these files extensions on the end of it to let you know what sort of thing it is. That's pretty typical in Linux too, although a lot of times if something doesn't have any file extension on it at all, we assume that it's a text file. And here I've actually put .txt on the end of these text files because I know that if I don't, I usually get a lot of questions about it. But this isn't something that's required in Linux. If we just had something that said Gettysburg, we could at least have some sort of guess that it was something that was a text file, right? So there are a couple ways to tell what kind of things files are. I think probably what you guys have noticed already is that directories typically show up in blue. Now that's because of the way that Linux is set up. This particular version of Linux is set up. That's not set up to be sort of an industry standard thing. So let me go ahead and CD back to here, and we're going to talk about some other options that you have with the ls command. And typically what we've done with ls is just typed ls, but what I want to show you guys now is that there are options that we can put on the end of the ls command. Remember, we talked about what options were in the last class, and to change the behavior of it. And if I type ls-l, that's a lowercase l, not a 1, this is going to give me what's called a long listing. And so this gives me a lot more detail. I think we may have gone over this in when we were talking about chapter 2. But one of the things that you're going to notice here is that there's a string of text in between, or not in between, but ahead of each one of these things, right? and the first thing here, it says D. Now that D tells you that it's a directory, which you already know because it's blue, but that's not something that is always implemented on all Linux systems. So looking for this lowercase d at the beginning of the line is a little bit more of a better indication. Now, if I go into downloads, remember I'm using tab completion here, and do an ls-l, you can see that this doesn't have a D on it. Well, if there's nothing there at all, it's going to assume that this is not a directory, right? There's some other things that it could be, but right now, as a general rule, if we're seeing something that doesn't have if it's just a tick mark right there, it just tells us that this is a normal file. Now, this rwx rw dash r dash dash. We'll talk about what that means a little bit later in the class. We don't need to really worry about that now. But what I want you to see right now is that thing at the beginning of the line is gonna give you more information than just ls without the L at the end. The other thing that I want to show you guys, I'm going to go back a level here, is there's another option that I have that's called ls-a. And if you look at this, suddenly there's a lot more files than there were when I just hit ls. So what gives? What happened? Well, in Windows, you have a capability of making files invisible. And Windows will do something to tell a file system that this isn't a file that needs to be displayed. Linux does this too. And the way it does it is that anything that starts with a period is an invisible file. It's referred to as an invisible file, and it'll only show up if you type an A with ls, which says that the A there stands for all. It says give me all the files. So you can see that what you've got here, bash profile is information about how the shell is set up. So is bash rc. Bash history is something that should store all the information about the previous commands that I've run. We've talked about the history command. I think I asked you to use that to turn in your last lab assignment. That's where that information is stored. So anything that the file system doesn't necessarily want you to see, because you're not going to have to use it that frequently, is going to start with a period, and it's not going to show up unless you do an ls-a. Now the other thing you can do with ls is you can combine these things here. If I type ls-al, what that's going to do is that's going to give me all the files, and it's going to give me a long listing of everything. You can see that something like this right here looks real different than the output from just ls. So we've really changed the behavior of this command by sort of stacking options that we have for this. So let's go ahead and go back to var log and do an ls-l here and see what we've got. So you can see that we've got some directories and some files in here. One of the things that I want to talk about is that something that has a .log at the end is going to be some sort of log file. Anything that has a .old at the end is probably something that was, in this case, this is you can see the xorg.0.log.old. Now, Linux will write data to a file, and after it does that for a while, after that log file either gets to a certain size or it's been doing it for a certain amount of time, it's going to take all the information in that log file and copy it to a .old file, instead of just having one big file. So that's one of the things that can happen here. Now, there are a whole bunch of things that you can put as dot and then something at the end, and the book has a little listing of things that you may encounter that are sort of common file name extensions in Linux, and this is on page 99. If you have a .c file, that's something that's been written in C. CPP is going to be C++. .txt is text files, but like I said, a lot of these files are actually text files, but they don't have a .text about them after them. That's not really required. And then a lot of things like .jpeg or .pdf is going to be something that you're probably familiar with from Windows. Those are going to be either a PDF file or a what was the other one that I said? A JPEG is going to be an image file. and there are a lot of things like a .sh is going to be a shell script file. TCL is a programming language that gets used in Linux sometimes. So if you see a .tcl file, that's what that is. So um, the other thing that we might want to talk about here is executable files. And in order to show you one of these, I have to use a couple of commands that we're not really supposed to, that we haven't talked about yet. And that is, if I'm bash is an executable file here. So if I do an ls-l bin bash, you can see that this one shows up in green. Now, most of the Linux executables, not well, maybe not most of them, but a lot of them live inside this /bin directory. So that bin stands for binary. And what you'll notice here is this: not only does this show up in green, but the other way we can tell that this is an executable file is that there's an X right here. And we'll talk about how to change that and what that means later. But what I want you to see is if you cd into bin and do an ls-l, you're going to see a whole bunch of files here that are in green. These things that are blue, the light blue that start with an L, that is a linked file. And you can tell that it's a linked file because, first of all, it has an L right here, and then also it shows you kind of the file name and then what it's actually pointing to. So if you type this in and you think that's the command that you're running, you're actually going to be running this one. That's probably about all that we want to talk about right there. Something wrong has gone right here. I'm not sure exactly what that means. But that's kind of when you're navigating around the Linux file system, you'll probably want to have some sort of idea of what you're looking at, and looking at files using ls, knowing what the colors mean, and knowing how to look for things. Remember, the D here explains that it's a directory. The L means it's a linked file. If it's green and it has an X here, that means it's going to be an executable file. And then a lot of the same sort of things work with the file extensions like you would expect. .html obviously is going to be something that's a web page. But be aware that Linux does a lot of this stuff manually. If you're used to Windows, where you just put a file extension on it and it's smart enough to change a bunch of stuff, Linux doesn't necessarily do that. It doesn't care what you use the file name extension as. It's gonna want you to still sort of know what it is and be able to treat it accordingly. So that's about all we're going to talk about with this. The next thing that we're going to talk about is actually how to do stuff with text files. So those text files that we downloaded at the beginning, we'll take a look at those and see what we can do to see what's going on inside them.